Let's turn on the captions here, and people are coming in. Hello, everyone. Everyone's coming in. We're waiting for a couple dozen people, at least more than that, actually. But numbers are going up. Hi, everyone. If you want to let us know where you're tuning in from, we'd love that. If you don't want to tell us where you are, perhaps what brought you here this evening. Um, yeah, chat away. Um, the chat box is open. Just make sure that when you put things in the chat box that you put them for everyone rather than hosts and panelists. Hosts and panelists just mean that the three of us can see it, but no one else. So we want to make sure that everyone can see your comments. And we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And thanks so much for joining us for this virtual program for Before the Gilded Age, W. Corcoran and the Rise of American Capital and Culture by Mark L. Goldstein. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are very happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. If you are not a member, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs like this one, the House and Museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and much more. Please visit our website for more information or reach out to me tonight or at any time. Now on to our guests. Our author, Mark L. Goldstein, is an educator and author. Recently, he retired as a director at the United States Government Accountability Office. Mr. Goldstein is the author of America's Hollow Government, How Washington Has Failed the People. Mr. Goldstein holds a BS in journalism from Syracuse University, MPA from George Washington University, MA from the University of Maryland at College Park, and a PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park. Our moderator is our very own executive director, Peter Roos. He's been the executive director here at the Mark Twain House Museum since 2017. And before that, he was the executive director of the Newport Restoration Foundation for 18 years. So during this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. If you have a specific question, though, please put that in the Q&A section. It's down on the bottom left of the screen. And you can ask your question at any time. You don't have to wait until we get to the Q&A section, which will be in about 40 minutes or so. That is all from me. I will turn this over to Mark and Peter. Please sit back and enjoy.
All right.
Great.
Hi, Mark.
Thank you, Omar.
Welcome.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes, thank you, Omar. It's good to see you again.
Likewise.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to talk about your book with you tonight because it's sort of right in our Mark Twain wheelhouse as far as timing goes. They were contemporaries to a certain extent, and although I'm not sure, and you aren't either, that Mark Twain ever met Corcoran. It's certainly a possibility. And I did find out today, and didn't tell you, that Mark Twain's best friend, Joe Twitchell, certainly did meet William Corcoran. So in any case, let's start I'd just love you to tell me a little bit about what made you decide to focus on Corcoran. He's not somebody whose name we hear a heck of a lot, especially since the gallery closed.
Well, that's exactly why I decided to write the book, because he's probably one of the least known people who had a very large influence on the American capital and on the country. And most people had never heard of him unless perhaps they had been to the Corcoran Gallery before it closed at some point. But he was a man of considerable contributions to the country, to the capital, but a lot of complexities and controversies as well. And that all together wrapped up made him a very interesting person to write about. I started the book quite a few years ago, and even at the end, I was sort of disappointed to be done with it because he had become a kind of a friend in the years that I had come to know him through his writing. Although the one thing I finally did tell myself is that I would probably never write another book in which the sources and materials were not on the typewriter instead of a quill pen.
So how did you get your original introduction to him, though? Was it the gallery?
No, well, I knew about the gallery when I moved to Washington 30 some years ago, but I kept coming across him in other ways. There's a Corcoran Street in Washington, D.C., right in the heart of D.C., and in fact, right next to Riggs Street. There is quite a lot of other sort of lesser known tributes to him in the Capitol. His photo, not his photo, his painting, more than his photo, his painting portraits of him appear in many places. And if you know what he looks like, you suddenly find yourself face to face with him. So it's interesting. And of course, the gallery. Many of his contributions to the city still exist in one form or another. And so he just kept popping up over and over again as I wandered around the city and became a resident and became acquainted with the city's history.
Fascinating. And as I read the book, I realized, we look at finances today and banking and the financial underpinnings of this country. And as I read the early chapters and thought about the early republic, I had never quite put a finger on just what a Wild West show it was when it came to finance and banking in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. And that's the world in which Corcoran really gains his majority and really starts into business. And so I thought it might be good to set the stage for you, telling us a little bit about finance and banking, which might not be the most appealing topic for everybody in the world, but we constantly, whether, whatever financial misdeeds are happening in the country today, we constantly hear about how banks are maybe not doing the best thing in the world, but it was a whole lot worse 200 years ago.
That's a good point, Peter. And now try not to bore people with it, but very quickly, banking in the early republic, in the early national period, and in the antebellum period, was sort of a Wild West. You're right about that. Every bank printed its own money, and it was very difficult to tell what its value was as the banks themselves ebbed and flowed, and their collateral ebbed and flowed over time. And so Corcoran, among other people, got their start basically acting as brokers for banknotes from different banks around the country and discounted them according to what they knew or believed the value of those particular banknotes at any one time would be. And it was how the country really operated in the absence of a modern checking and credit system, and in the absence really of a national, national specie or gold. There was very little actual money, real money, that one could, use. And so far beyond bartering, you had this system of discount bankers who it was their business to know banks around the country, and that's how he got his start. And he built his own bank. He and his partner Riggs built a bank, became Corcoran and Riggs, and then when Corcoran left the business, it was taken over by the Riggs family, and it was sold only in recent years to PNC, a major bank today. It existed for nearly 170 years as an independent bank, which very few banks actually have the privilege of doing in the United States.
Fascinating. So there were all of these independent privately minted currencies around. So, and they all had their own values. So it was sort of like trading stocks in a way.
In a way, yes. And that was probably what led him into being very familiar with debt instruments. And he became an expert in public debt over time, which is really how he made his first money, by selling public debt and actually funding most of the Mexican-American War in the
Hmm.
late 1840s and early 50s. And
Yeah.
he was able to corner the market for the government's debt several years running through some nefarious kinds of activities, things that really would be illegal today, but in the day were not
Yeah.
illegal at all. They were annoying and
Hmm.
perhaps immoral, but they were not illegal.
Yeah, and he made enormous friends with so many people in Congress and in the Senate and in government, and he traded on those individual relationships to make his fortune, didn't he?
That's right. One of the most amazing things about Corcoran was that he transcended time and politics. He lived a very long life. He lived to be 90 at an age when most people really didn't make it much past 50.
Mm.
And he lived almost all of that life across the street from the White House.
Mm.
So he was on personal terms with every president from Andrew Jackson to Grover Cleveland, and which is a pretty significant amount of time and number of famous people, and of course of very different parties. So we're talking about
Mm.
Democrats, we're talking about Whigs, and we're talking about Republicans, all of whom held that office. And he maintained very good relations with all parties and both houses of Congress. And he was probably the premier behind the scenes actor of his time, which is also what made him probably one of the earliest American lobbyists in the Capitol.
Mm.
Lobbying started in the state capitals, not in the federal capital. But by the late 1830s, it was starting to percolate in the Capitol, and he was one of the first people to really leverage it and make money at it.
And it struck me that he must have been a very personable guy because he, as you say, he was working all sides of the aisle and everybody seemed to relate to him. Maybe not everybody, but an awful lot of people did.
Just about everybody. One of the most fascinating things about Corcoran is that he had this ability to get enemies into the same room
Hmm.
and to basically do his bidding. He
Hmm.
would, and particularly it's most seen directly after the Civil War when he held a very big party to commemorate the birthday of George Washington in the new Corcoran Gallery of Art. It was just opening, and he used the
Hmm.
space, and he had basically every major living Confederate general and Union general in the
Hmm.
same room at his party. And
And
it was fascinating. And before the war, his drawing room and his dining room was one of the places in Washington where people sat around trying to fix what was the coming Civil War, obviously to no avail. But he had many of the people who would take different sides of that war around his dining room table just before the war.
and one might be tempted to think that he was strong-arming them because of the power he had, but one of the things I learned in the book was that his dinner parties were considered to be great entertainments as well.
Yes, yes. There was one Treasury Secretary who famously left his house, Corcoran's house, saying that he wished that the Treasury itself had been as full as he was that evening. And there were many such occasions. His dining room was known across the city as one of the places to be, and people from Europe who would come to his parties were would write home, and there are letters about how lavish his parties were, and that they were the envy not just of Washington, but they would be the envy of people on the continent as well.
Which is
So
fascinating because the continent usually turned up its nose at anything American, and often justly so. It was just we were not as sophisticated as them, but apparently Corcoran was.
Apparently he was, and he had his drawing room, and of course his gallery. Before it became the Corcoran Gallery of Art, before he built an independent gallery, his collection was in his house, and of course that he built a separate wing of his house just to house his private collection before he donated the whole thing to the Corcoran Gallery, and so people would come there and be entertained in the gallery as well.
And I want to move on to that as another subject in a little while, but before we do that, I don't want to get off the topic of politics just yet, because certainly the favors went back and forth, the money went back and forth, and I was surprised. I guess I would have known this as a historian if I'd stopped to think about it, but I was surprised at the lavishness with which money changed hands in a way that we would find highly illegal today.
That's correct. And he was not, of course, the only person who
No.
Purveyed in this fashion. To get anything done at that time, you had to help people monetarily. He was, it was sort of strange. There is a record that shows that he gave people money, that he loaned people money, that he bought them financial instruments of various kinds, stocks and bonds and the like, to hold. He loaned people a lot of money and then tore up the IOUs often. But at other times, and I'm not exactly sure if it was the person or the time or the mood or maybe the public tenor, he was more of a stickler in how he handled his money in making arrangements to influence other people. So it varied over time, I think, in part depending on the times and in part depending on what the actual need was.
And we're not talking about the shadier side of American politics. We're talking about some of the great statesmen like Webster.
Yes, absolutely. Webster was constantly in debt, and he lived far beyond his means. And he and many other politicians found it very convenient to have their favorite banker in their pocket. And and the ironic thing is that much of the money that Corcoran used to give other people or to loan people money or to or to purchase stocks and bonds and the like was government money. It was money deposited by the government into Corcoran's coffers for various functions, because he acted as the government's agent for a variety of different things in dispensing money. So he would hold the government's money and leverage it for his own needs as well. So yes, today that would be frowned upon by the Securities and Exchange Commission, by the Treasury Department, by the banking organizations, definitely. But at the time, it was not illegal. The difference was he was better at it than anybody else, and that led to his success.
Yeah. Although I gather there were those that didn't like him and the power that he had too.
There were some, but most of the people who did not like him before the war, most of the people who did not like him at that point in time were his competitors, the other banking houses, and and the other financiers. Not that most politicians, or many certainly, were more than happy to engage with him, to talk with him. And remember, throughout this time, he was a benefactor. He was already a benefactor philanthropically throughout the city and the country. And so his good works came along with his money.
And his good works were in a profusion. He was very much a man of the Enlightenment in many ways, even though that era was somewhat before. He seemed to have a great many interests. But let's go back. He was complex, as most people are, especially from a historical sense. And he's somebody who's coming from the South. And so there was more than a hint of chattel slavery in the background of his family. and even in him, and yet he improved that over the course of his life. So I'd like to touch briefly on that too, because it
Absolutely.
needs to be a balanced picture.
Right. It's an important component of who he was, as was sort of the change that he made over time. He came from the Tidewater South, so Maryland, Virginia. He was born in Georgetown, which was a very southern city at the time,
Hmm.
and it was all tobacco farmers and tobacco agents and the like. And most people in Georgetown enslaved people, and so did the Corcoran family. And so he grew up with uh, enslaved people in his home. And as an adult, he had at least one slave, according to the census of 1840. There are some records that indicate that he may have had more than one, but it isn't clear. There's different records out there with respect to who he owned. But what happened was that over time, he came to conclude, although you don't see this in anything really that he wrote that exists, but you see it more through his actions. He came to conclude that he didn't want to be a slaveholder anymore. And before the District of Columbia emancipated its slaves, which was about 15 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, he freed his slaves. He had a woman named Mary and her children, and he also freed several other people as well, who were, I believe, were related to her.
Hmm.
And then later on, he actually freed other enslaved people upon several individuals' requests, including one of the presidents, President Tyler, I believe, had he had a coach driver whose wife had been spirited away back to the South to return to slavery, and Corcoran was able to send some people basically to go after her and paid for her freedom and brought her back.
Hmm.
And so he did that several times. And so he changed his views over time. There is some sort of uh, murky evidence, I would call it, that he may have been involved, and I have a couple footnotes in the book. He may or may not have been involved in the slave trade very early in his career. Um, there are receipts not in his personal record books, but in the record books of several of his business associates. Um, but it's very unclear whether or not he was, and the world has to wait for more information to come to light on that. But yes, he did own enslaved people, and over time he did free some enslaved people as well.
And yet he, I think you said, also loaned money to Black-owned businesses, do I have that right?
Yes, Corcoran's Bank was one of the few banks in the capital that actually allowed African Americans to have deposits in the bank, and he also helped over time in his philanthropic impulses. He helped a number of black businesses and black individuals who were down on their luck in many instances, many occasions.
Hmm. Well,
That's not to say that the majority of his relationships and clients were not with white people. They certainly
of
were,
course,
but
yeah.
he did have he did have this desire to help people regardless of where they stood in American life.
Hmm. Um, he absents himself from the Civil War by leaving the United States altogether. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, his daughter, his only child, um, married a Louisiana congressman in 1859 on the brink of the Civil War, and and when the Civil War broke out, her husband, like most of the Southern delegation, left the city and went south and joined the Confederacy in one form or another. And so Corcoran's daughter ended up going south into the Confederacy and joining, had joined her husband, and he became the secretary to the diplomatic mission to France that the Confederacy set up in order to gain diplomatic recognition and to try and get money for the Confederacy.
Hmm.
And so she ended up going to France with him, and so Corcoran's daughter was already in Europe, and as the Civil War continued in 1861 and 1862, Corcoran and many people like him, who were Southern sympathizers but loyal to the country, found it more and more difficult to be in the capital city.
Mhm.
And over time, he was accused of various nefarious things, including a wild-haired plot to kill President Lincoln, of which there's no evidence that he was really involved in that. Later on, it became clear that it was someone who was trying to blackmail him potentially when it was investigated after the war. But ultimately, he decided that he would be better off spending the remainder of the war in Europe. So he did. He traveled to England, and then he traveled to France and stayed in Paris and with his daughter. But he did that he wasn't, I think, sure when he would come back, because he converted most of his money to gold, put it in the hold of that ship, and brought it over to Europe with him. And he very cleverly leased his home, his beautiful mansion across from the White House. He leased it to the French legation so that it
Hmm.
could not be taken over by the Union, which took
Hmm.
over just about every other property that he had.
Hmm.
But they could not get his home
Hmm.
because it had diplomatic immunity.
And he had a lot of ties in Britain and France anyway from his business dealings.
Yes, he did. Right, from his financial dealings, and of course the various diplomats from Europe who had lived in Washington and had dined many times at his table in the 1850s.
Hmm.
So
Well,
he had many connections.
let's move on to his philanthropic pursuits. And you said he had a vision for his philanthropy. And so, that's altogether a different side of him than what we've just been discovering. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure, he had different kinds of philanthropy that he was interested. His father was on the board of what would become George Washington University, and uh, so Corcoran aided a number of institutions of higher learning that range from George Washington University to William and Mary College to Washington and Lee University. It really went all over the place. He helped many educational institutions. He either helped or created all of the funding, provided all the funding for a number of religious institutions, churches. He provided money for various monuments. He was a huge contributor to the capital city. He was constantly trying to improve it. We have him to thank, Corcoran, for some of the earliest landscaping around the National Mall, the White House, and the Capitol building itself, and as well as the grounds of the Smithsonian and Lafayette Park. He was very instrumental in much of that landscaping. Ironically, interestingly, he was a prolific gardener and landscaper herself. He was very interested in landscaping and horticulture, and was even president of the American Horticultural Association for a time, things like that. But
So
and
that's
after,
actually sort of a physical part of his legacy that we still see what
correct.
he did in Washington. And I think you said he hired A.J. Downing to do his own house, who was one of the great landscape designers of the 19th century. So certainly didn't stint there.
Yes, Downing landscaped his own home and then was used by Corcoran. Corcoran convinced him to work with the government and to do the early landscaping of the National Mall. It would change greatly over the years, but the first landscaping endeavor was at the behest of Corcoran and one or two other city fathers in conjunction with the president at the time. And then some of his other philanthropic deeds, he was instrumental in finishing the Washington Monument, which had languished for many years. He built homes after the Civil War for people who were made down on their luck by the war, and soldiers as well. He built individual institutions, basically rest homes, if you will. He built orphanages, schools, high schools. He built roads. He provided money for roads and aqueducts and many other sort of infrastructure projects in and around Washington and in other places. He and then curiously enough, he provided money to many individuals and other kinds of causes, other kinds of philanthropic causes. But often he would just hand out money to people who came to his house, people we didn't know, who just basically rang his doorbell or lined up out front of places where they knew he would go, like the gallery or the bank, and he would write people checks. He wrote a check to a perfect stranger literally the morning that he passed away.
Interesting.
And so he was well known for that kind of charity.
And that's certainly an era when the thought of institutionalizing charity is growing in nature. We've got about 10 minutes left. And so I'd really like to talk about his art collecting right now, because so many people know his name best through the Corcoran Gallery. And he just started collecting a lot. And there were a few people at that time, including Wadsworth here in Connecticut, who were collecting American art. But Corcoran was another great example of somebody who was collecting Hudson River School when it was contemporary. And talk a little bit about how he started collecting art, to the best of your knowledge.
Sure. He started slowly, but and may have actually collected some art as a young man in his 30s and early 40s. But most of it came a little bit later as he could afford it more. And he purchased some European art, but started pretty early to collect Hudson River School and landscapes, American landscapes. I think it accorded well with his view of the country and creating sort of a patriotic dreamscape of what the country should look like, and when it didn't always look that way. And of course, the Hudson River School often idealized landscapes, and he believed that is what America ought to look like. And I think it's not, well, shall we say, unusual or that he did this at a time when, of course, the country itself was coming apart and becoming, more difficult to live in, and where people were having to make decisions about their futures, and war was coming, and he tried to still encourage that kind of a view, a mythic sort of view of America in some ways. And I think that was part of the reason that he did that. I think he was a very patriotic man who really loved his country. Again, he obviously had some Southern sympathies that got him in trouble because he was a very loyal man to a fault, and didn't always know when it was time to let some people fall by the wayside.
Yeah.
But his art, certainly by 1850, he had a fairly remarkable collection, and one of about the best collection in Washington, and enough that he was able to open, as I said, this sort of private wing of his home, and showed the collection. His was not the first house museum. There were other people, especially in New York, who would open up their home to now and again to people. But as far as I was able to determine, he was the first, perhaps person who regularly opened it up on regular hours to anyone who wanted to come. And that seems to me to be very similar to the first true art gallery in America. And then, of course, the Corcoran Gallery itself was exactly that before Chicago, before New York, and other museums that opened.
And he built two purpose-built galleries, and one overflowed, correct?
Well, he he built the initial gallery. The second gallery was not completed until after he passed away.
Oh,
The gallery that was where the Corcoran was when it went out of business um, was built. They were already starting to build and to think about building that toward the end of his life, because they knew that they needed a more room for an art school. And so they were purposely driven in that endeavor. And so he knew about that. What what today is the Smithsonian Museum across the street from the White House is the original Corcoran Gallery of Art.
Fascinating.
So it was just really down the street from his home.
Yeah, yeah. And that gallery survived until, what was it, 2014, 16?
14, that's correct.
14, yeah, okay.
That's correct.
Okay.
When it was decommissioned, most of its works went to the National Gallery.
Right, and certainly can still be seen there.
Absolutely.
Yes. And I've certainly looked at some of them, and there's some fantastic pieces in that collection.
There are some very famous pieces.
Yeah, and they
He
were
put a number of artists really on the map in that day.
Yeah, certainly. So let's finish up by, after reading the book, it really struck me that this was somebody who was a very significant historical personage, and we have lost track of him. And it's not like you can go and find many biographies of Corcoran besides yours. You're kind of it, Mark.
That's right.
So why do you think we have lost track of him? Why did he disappear?
That's a very good question. And, I think because he spent most of his life behind the scenes. He did obviously a lot, and he really wanted to get things done, and that's what he did, but he was never a politician. He never sort of sought the limelight. He would just finish one thing that he was doing and move on to the next. He was very sort of peripatetic that way. He just kept going until he ran out of steam. But he was constantly involved in influencing the capital and the country in so many ways, right up to the end. Even at the end of his life, he helped to influence the purchase of land for Rock Creek Park. He helped to influence the president on choices for the District of Columbia government. Nothing really happened in the DC government itself that he didn't know about or influence well into his 80s. So he did all of it really behind the scenes, which is how he apparently was most comfortable.
And generally, I think you'd think of him as a more or less benevolent spirit in this, because we can certainly see people like, say, Robert Moses in New York that we don't think of as benevolent spirits, but it sounds more or less like, with some obvious exceptions, he meant to do well.
He meant to do well. He certainly had his detractors, people who felt that he was a traitor to the country, although it really wasn't proven. And but his good works definitely outlasted him, and it can be argued that that was exactly why he made them, that it was in part the reason. But at the end of the day, I think his philanthropy and his good works went far beyond that. As I said, because he gave his money to people who would not go down in posterity and were anonymous, he had a really good heart as well. So again, a complex person.
Yeah, everybody is complex that makes an imprint upon our history. So how would you think of his legacy if you wanted to sum it up?
I
aside
think
from
that
what you just said in the last paragraph.
sure. I think that he was a fascinating man who tried to help the world around him in so many ways, and was quite successful at it. And I think his lowest moment was when the world, when the world that he knew went to war, and he tried his best to surmount that. There was a lot of tragedy in his life as well. We didn't talk about his own wife. He married a woman many years his junior, uh, and she died after at the age of 21 of tuberculosis, and he never remarried. He went another 50 years without marrying again, and
And
so
it has been said of him that he may have been gay, and I know that you looked into that a little bit.
once again, there's no evidence per se that comes to light. If no letters that really indicate that, but but among his best friends was, America's first president who was gay, and but once again, he was friends with most of the presidents in his day, so it's hard to discern. But
Yeah,
he is a person who has been largely lost, and that's why I wrote the biography,
yeah, yeah.
hoping to bring him back to life somewhat.
Well, it's important to remember these folks in American history, and this is a great contribution to that because I think our understanding of our capital city, of our finances, of the beginnings of philanthropy in this country, I think they're all captured in the book. And so I urge people to go out and get it and read it.
Thank you.
And Omar, I think we're ready for questions if you want to pop back in. And it's time. It's 20 up. So
Yes. Let's see here. Well, Susan asked, I wonder how all his family grief affected his personality and how he became so involved in politics and finance.
Thanks for the question. I think his as I indicated, he did have a lot of tragedy. He lost his wife 3 years after he married her. Two of his three children were dead by the age of three. And the one daughter that I did mention that married the Louisiana congressman and ended up in France also died young of tuberculosis, just like her mother. And Corcoran ended up bringing the grandchildren back to the United States, and they lived in his mansion in Washington with him
Hmm.
for many years.
Mhm.
And so he had a lot of tragedy. A couple things we never really talked about, some of his other philanthropic impulses. He built several cemeteries in Washington, D.C. And you can I think see that and many of the people who were his friends are buried in the cemeteries that he was party to. So I think the grief did enter his life quite a lot, and I don't know that he was lonely. It doesn't come through in what I know about him, but he 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 never did remarry. He was faithful to the memory of his young wife.
Mhm. Mhm. Geraldine asks, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, how do you determine how do you determine how a public person should be judged, given both the positive and negatives of Corcoran, for example, and she also added, or the Sacklers.
Sure, I think right philanthropy can be used by many people to cover up misdeeds, and that may have been done by Corcoran. I try not to judge it. Again, he helped both after the Civil War was when he was most prolific in his philanthropy. He helped both the North and the South to rebuild, and but also was very helpful to many individuals who had nothing, to do with any sort of public rebuilding, and for which he would never get any recognition whatsoever. So he just didn't give to big institutions, flashy kinds of things where his name would be, festooned. He really did things out of his belief, I think, at the time. Uh, you know, People's names didn't go on the side of buildings, in those days, the way they do today. But he did give away almost all of his money, and
Hmm.
which was quite a lot for its day. It was before the industrial capitalists like Rockefeller came along. It was more the mercantile types of wealthy people, but still, he gave away a lot of money and tried to do what he thought was right, and to try to use the capital city as something bigger than itself by opening up an art gallery that was often free, and helping to make it more beautiful through the mall and things like that.
Excellent. If anyone has any more questions, please ask them. We have just one last question. Also from Geraldine. Geraldine asked, "Are you familiar with the book Trust? Do you see any correlation with Corcoran?" Trust was actually a finalist for the Mark Twain American Voice Award, and I believe it takes place maybe 40 years after Corcoran's death. But are you familiar with the book?
I'm not. I'm sorry. No, I don't know it.
Yeah.
Well, it would be fiction since it was in the American Voice Awards category. So.
Yes.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, Mark, thank you so much. This has been
My pleasure.
enlightening, and I really hope that people go and explore Corcoran a little bit more, because he's an interesting piece of American history that, as I've said a couple of times now, we've sort of lost track of, and he gives us a more complete picture of who we are in his complexities. And history is never the sound bites that we sometimes try and break it down to. And so I think Corcoran is an interesting example of how we learn about our history by looking at its complexities and its contrasts. So
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure.
great. Thank you.
Thank you so
Great.
much, everyone. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you. Cool. Thanks so much.